December 17th, 1944, 0647 hours, 3 miles northeast of the village of Lanzarote, Belgium. Temperature, 14 degrees below zero Fahrenheit.
Staff Sergeant Edward Kowalski was 22 years old, and in approximately 90 seconds, he was going to die. He did not know this yet. What he knew was that the fog was so thick he could not see past the glasses plate of his M4A3E8 Sherman tank, that his radio man had stopped receiving transmissions from battalion headquarters 40 minutes ago, that somewhere in the frozen forest ahead of him there were German forces of unknown size and composition, and that the breakfast he had eaten 4 hours earlier, cold beans from a tin eaten standing in the snow, was not sitting well in his stomach. Kowalski had been a tank commander for exactly 11 days. Before that, he had been a gunner. Before that, a loader. He had worked his way up through the crew positions the way most tankers did in the winter of 1944, by surviving while the men above him did not. His previous commander, Lieutenant James Hartley of Oak Park, Illinois, had taken a sniper round through the throat on December 6th while standing in the turret hatch during what was supposed to be a routine resupply.
Hartley had been 24 years old, a graduate of Northwestern University, engaged to a girl named Elizabeth who worked at the War Department in Washington. He had bled out in Kowalski's arms in approximately 2 minutes, unable to speak, his eyes fixed on something Kowalski could not see.
There had been no ceremony, no time for grief. The company was short on officers, shorter on experienced non-commissioned officers, and Kowalski had been battlefield promoted to Staff Sergeant and given command of the Sherman he had served in since Normandy. The tank's name was Donna, painted in white letters on the turret side, a name chosen by the original crew in England before the invasion. Of that original crew, none remained.
Kowalski was the longest-serving member, and he had only joined after St. Lo. The crew that morning consisted of 5 men. Kowalski commanded from the turret. Corporal William "Billy" Dawson of Tallahassee, Florida, age 19, served as gunner. He had steady hands and better eyesight than any man in the company, but he had never fired the 76mm main gun at a living target. Private First Class Anthony Russo of Brooklyn, New York, age 20, was the loader, stocky, strong, capable of sustaining a rate of fire that would exhaust larger men, but prone to panic under pressure. Private Harold Washington of Detroit, Michigan, age 21, drove the tank, a former mechanic who understood the Ford GAA engine better than the engineers who had designed it, but who had difficulty following orders he considered tactically unsound. And Private Eugene Steinberg of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, age 18, operated the radio and the hull-mounted .30 caliber machine gun, the youngest of them, the most frightened, the one who still wrote to his mother every night using a flashlight under his blanket so the others would not see.
These were the 5 men inside Belladonna on the morning of December 17, 1944. None of them had slept more than 3 hours in the previous 48.
None of them knew that the largest German offensive since 1940 had begun approximately 18 hours earlier, that 3 German armies were currently smashing through the American lines along an 80-mile front, that the chaos on the roads behind them was not confusion but the beginning of a rout, and that the position they had been ordered to hold, a crossroads designated .147 on their maps, was directly in the path of the 1st SS Panzer Division's main axis of advance.
They knew only that they had been told to hold the crossroads until relieved. That relief was expected by noon, that the fog was too thick to see anything, and that the silence from the radio was beginning to feel less like technical difficulty and more like abandonment.
At 0648 hours, Private Steinberg reported contact.
"Sergeant, I've got engine noise. Multiple vehicles. Bearing, I can't tell. It's echoing off the trees, but it's close, real close."
Kowalski felt his stomach clench. He pulled himself up through the commander's hatch, ignoring the cold that bit into his exposed skin, and listened. Steinberg was right. Engines. Diesel engines by the sound of them, deeper than the gasoline engines the Americans used, with the distinctive rumble that Kowalski had learned to recognize in the hedgerows of Normandy. German engines, and not just one or two. He counted at least 4 distinct sources, possibly more, the sound distorted by the fog and the frozen trees.
Washington, start the engine. Dawson, traverse left 45 degrees. Load AP.
The orders came automatically, the product of 6 months of combat that had burned certain responses into his nervous system. But even as he gave them, Kowalski knew they were insufficient. He was facing an unknown number of enemy vehicles, in fog that limited visibility to perhaps 30 meters, with a single Sherman tank and no infantry support. The 2 infantry platoons that were supposed to be dug in around the crossroads had never arrived, lost somewhere in the chaos of the night, or perhaps already dead.
He was alone.
The Ford engine coughed to life, shattering the morning silence. Below him, Kowalski heard Russo slam an armor-piercing round into the breech of the 76mm gun, the M1A2, a significant improvement over the short-barreled 75 that had proven so inadequate against German armor earlier in the war.
The 76 could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panzer IV at reasonable range, could kill a Panther through the side or rear, and could even threaten a Tiger if the angle was favorable and the range was close. But Kowalski had learned in Normandy that the theoretical capabilities of a weapon meant nothing when the enemy had better armor, better guns, and more experience.
The first German vehicle emerged from the fog at 0651 hours. It was not what Kowalski expected. He had been preparing himself for a Panther or perhaps a Tiger. What he saw instead was a Kübelwagen, a light utility vehicle, the German equivalent of a jeep, moving slowly down the road with its headlights off, a soldier standing in the passenger seat, scanning the fog with binoculars, a reconnaissance element. The Germans were not attacking, they were probing, feeling their way forward, uncertain of what lay ahead. For a fraction of a second, Kowalski hesitated. The Kübelwagen was not a threat. He could let it pass, remain hidden in the fog, avoid revealing his position. But if the reconnaissance element reported the crossroads clear, the main force would follow. And if the main force caught him by surprise—
Steinberg, hull gun, engage.
The .30 caliber machine gun stuttered to life, and Kowalski watched through the fog as the tracers found the Kübelwagen. The vehicle swerved, tipped, and rolled into the ditch by the side of the road. He saw one figure crawl free and disappear into the trees. The other did not move. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then the fog ahead of him lit up with muzzle flashes. The first round struck the turret at 0652 hours. Kowalski felt the impact through his entire body, a sound like a giant hammer striking an anvil, followed by a shriek of metal that seemed to go on forever. But the round had not penetrated. The Sherman's turret armor, 3.5 inches of cast steel at its thickest point, had held, for now.
Contact front. Dawson, do you have a target?
I can't see anything, Sarge. The fog. Fire at the muzzle flash. Russo, keep loading.
The 76mm gun fired, and the recoil rocked the tank backward. Through the haze, Kowalski saw the shell strike something, a shower of sparks, a secondary explosion, but he could not tell what he had hit or whether it was destroyed. Another round struck the Sherman, this time on the hull, and he heard Washington curse as the driver's compartment filled with dust and fragments of spalled metal.
Washington, back us up. 20 meters.
The Sherman lurched backward, and for a moment, Kowalski lost all sense of orientation. The fog swirled around him. The muzzle flashes came from multiple directions now, and he realized with cold certainty that he had made a critical error.
By engaging the reconnaissance element, he had revealed his position to the main force, and now he was blind, outnumbered, and taking fire from enemies he could not see.
Kowalski felt the Sherman shudder, heard a sound like fabric tearing, and then the interior of the turret was filled with fire and smoke. He screamed, an involuntary sound torn from his throat by pain he had never imagined, and threw himself backward away from the flames. Below him, someone else was screaming. The fire suppression system activated, spraying the interior with carbon dioxide, and for a long moment, Kowalski could not breathe, could not see, could not think.
When his vision cleared, he saw that the round had penetrated the turret just below the gun mantlet, passed through the loader's station, and exited through the rear. Russo was on the floor of the turret basket, clutching his left arm, which was no longer attached to his shoulder. The stump was pumping blood in rhythmic spurts that painted the interior of the tank in arterial red.
Steinberg, first aid kit now.
But even as he shouted the order, Kowalski knew it was futile. A tourniquet could not stop arterial bleeding of this severity. Russo had minutes to live, perhaps less, and outside, the German guns were still firing.
Dawson, keep firing! Don't stop!
Kowalski dropped into the loader's position, pushing Russo's body aside and grabbed a round from the ready rack. His hands were slick with blood, Russo's blood, and the shell slipped in his grip, but he forced it into the breech and slammed it home. Dawson fired. The gun recoiled. Kowalski loaded another round.
They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive long enough to fight again. By 07:20 hours, Russo was dead. Kowalski had tied off the stump with a belt and 2 field dressings, but the blood loss was too severe, the shock too profound. Russo had stopped breathing at 07:11 and had not started again. They had left his body in the hull, below the turret basket, where it would not interfere with the operation of the gun.
By 07:20 hours, the Sherman had taken 7 direct hits. The turret traverse motor was damaged, forcing Dawson to rotate the turret manually using the hand crank, a process that took 12 seconds for a full rotation, compared to the normal 4. The right track had been struck by a glancing blow that bent 3 of the track links. Washington reported that they could still move, but only at reduced speed and with a persistent grinding noise that suggested imminent mechanical failure.
The periscopes on the commander's cupola were shattered, leaving Kowalski blind unless he exposed himself through the open hatch, and the radio, already unreliable, had gone completely silent. Whether from battle damage or the continuing atmospheric interference, Steinberg could not tell.
But Belladonna was still firing, and somewhere in the fog ahead, German tanks were burning. Kowalski had counted at least 3 kills, possibly 4. The first had been the vehicle he struck during the initial exchange, a Panzer IV, they learned later, its commander dead before he could issue a single order. The second was a half-track that had tried to flank them through the trees and had been caught by Steinberg's machine gun as it became mired in the snow. The third was another Panzer IV that had pushed too close in the fog, apparently believing the Sherman was destroyed, and had taken a 76mm round through the side armor at a range of 15 meters. Kowalski had seen the crew bail out, their uniforms on fire, before the ammunition inside the tank cooked off and turned the vehicle into a funeral pyre. The fourth possible kill was less certain. Dawson had fired at a muzzle flash in the fog and had seen a secondary explosion, but they had not been able to confirm the destruction. The German fire from that sector had ceased, however, which was confirmation enough for Kowalski's purposes. But the Germans were not retreating. They were adapting. At 0735 hours, Kowalski saw them for the first time clearly. The fog was beginning to lift. Not much, but enough to extend visibility to perhaps 50 meters, and through the haze he could make out shapes moving through the trees on both flanks. Infantry, German infantry,
in their distinctive coal scuttle helmets and field gray greatcoats, working their way around the crossroads in a classic envelopment maneuver.
If they reached the rear of the Sherman, they could disable the tank with grenades, or simply wait for a better angle and finish the job with a Panzerfaust.
Steinberg, infantry in the trees, both sides.
I see them, Sarge, but I can't traverse the hull gun that far.
Then use your carbine. Washington, I need you on the bow gun.
If I leave the driver's seat, we can't move.
We can't move anyway. That track is going to throw any minute. Get on the gun.
Washington hesitated. Kowalski could feel the hesitation, the calculation, the weighing of orders against judgment. But then he complied. The Hull machine gun opened up, spraying the tree line on the left side, and Kowalski heard return fire pinging off the armor. Small arms. No threat to the tank itself, but lethal to any crew member who exposed himself.
The infantry assault lasted 11 minutes. It felt like 11 hours. Kowalski fired his Thompson submachine gun through the commander's hatch, ducking back each time a bullet cracked past his head, watching the gray shapes move through the trees, watching some of them fall and others take their places. Dawson traversed the turret, slowly, agonizingly slowly with the hand crank, and fired the coaxial machine gun into clusters of advancing infantry.
Steinberg and Washington worked the hull gun in alternating bursts, limited by the narrow traverse arc, killing some and missing others. At 0746 hours, a Panzerfaust rocket streaked out of the fog and struck the Sherman's left sponson. The shaped charge warhead was designed to penetrate armor, but the angle was wrong. The rocket struck at almost 90 degrees to the horizontal, and the jet of molten copper was deflected along the surface rather than punching through. The sponson was destroyed, the external fuel tank ignited, and for a terrible moment, Kowalski thought the entire tank was on fire. But the main fuel tanks were inside the hull, protected by armor, and the external fire burned itself out within 2 minutes.
They had survived. Again.
By 0751 hours, the infantry assault had stalled. The Germans had pulled back into the trees, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. Kowalski counted at least 12 bodies in the snow around the crossroads. Young men, most of them. Boys in uniform who had been alive an hour ago and were now cooling in the Belgian winter. He felt nothing when he looked at them. He would feel something later, he knew, but not now.
Now there was only the next threat, the next target, the next few seconds of survival.
Anyone hit?
I took some fragments in the leg, Steinberg reported. His voice was steady, but Kowalski could hear the pain beneath it. I can still function.
Washington?
I'm good, Sarge, but this gun's running low on ammo. Maybe 200 rounds left.
Dawson? I'm fine, but Sarge, we've got maybe 6 AP rounds left. After that, it's just AG.
High explosive rounds, effective against infantry and soft-skinned vehicles, useless against armor. If the Germans sent another tank, a real tank, a Panther or a Tiger, they would have 6 chances to stop it. After that, they would be defenseless.
Kowalski looked at the bodies of the German soldiers in the snow, at the burning wreck of the Panzer IV still visible through the fog, at the shattered periscopes and the blood-stained interior of his tank. He thought about Rousseau's body, still lying in the hull below him. He thought about the radio silence, about the relief that was supposed to arrive by noon, about the 80 miles of German offensive that he did not know was happening.
He thought about dying here, in a frozen forest in a country he had never heard of before the war, 10,000 miles from Hamtramck, Michigan, where his mother was probably at this moment saying her morning rosary and praying for his safe return.
Then he pushed the thoughts aside and reloaded his Thompson.
"We hold until relieved," he said. "That's the order. We hold."
Psst! The next 4 hours passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. The fog lifted slowly, revealing a landscape of frozen devastation, shattered trees, burning vehicles, bodies in the snow. The Germans did not attack again, but they did not leave either. Kowalski could see them moving in the tree line, consolidating their positions, bringing up reinforcements. He could hear engines in the distance, more vehicles, more armor, and he knew that the next assault would be the last.
At 0930 hours, Steinberg managed to raise another American unit on the radio, a fragment of a transmission, barely audible through the static, but enough to convey the essential information. The front had collapsed. German forces were everywhere. No relief was coming. All units were ordered to withdraw to St. Vith if possible, to delay the enemy advance if withdrawal was not possible, and to destroy their equipment if capture was imminent. Kowalski listened to the transmission in silence. Then he switched off the radio to conserve the battery. "What do we do, Sarge?" Dawson asked. The young gunner's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. He had fired the main gun 23 times that morning. He had killed men. He was 19 years old, and he would never be 19 again.
"We hold," Kowalski said. "We hold until we can't hold any more. Then we fall back."
Fall back where? West, towards St. Vith. There are American units there, somewhere.
And if the track throws? If the engine dies?
Then we walk.
It was not much of a plan. It was not really a plan at all, but it was all Kowalski had, and saying it out loud made it feel real, made the future feel possible, even if that future was measured in hours rather than days. At 10:47 hours, the Germans attacked again.
This time, they did not make the mistake of probing. This time, they came in force. Kowalski counted 4 armored vehicles advancing through the trees, 2 Panzerfausts, a Panther, and something that made his blood freeze, a Tiger I. Its massive 88mm gun pointed directly at the crossroads, its 87 tons of armor and firepower moving through the forest like a prehistoric predator. The Tiger's frontal armor was 100mm thick. The Sherman's 76mm gun could not penetrate it at any range, at any angle. If the Tiger reached a firing position, if it got it clean shot at Donna, the battle would be over in seconds. "Dawson, target the Panzer IV on the left. Ignore the Tiger. We can't kill it." "Sarge, we can't kill it, but we can kill the others. If we kill enough of them, maybe they'll pull back. Maybe they'll go around. It's all we've got."
The 76mm fired. The round struck the Panzer IV just below the turret ring, and Kowalski watched the tank shudder, stop, and begin to smoke. The crew bailed out. One of them made it to the trees. The others did not, and then the ammunition cooked off, sending the turret spinning into the air in a column of fire and smoke.
Load! Target the second IV!
But the second Panzer IV had learned from the first. Its commander had seen the muzzle flash, had calculated the angle, and was already traversing his turret toward the Sherman. Kowalski saw the German gunfire, a flash, a streak of tracer, and then the world turned inside out.
The round struck the mantlet, the same place the earlier round had hit, the same weak point in the armor. But this time, the round did not penetrate cleanly. It struck the edge of the previous damage, deflected upward, and tore through the commander's cupola in a shower of metal fragments. Kowalski felt something hit his face, felt blood running into his eyes, felt himself falling backward into the turret basket.
For a moment, he was blind. For a moment, he was certain he was dying. Then his vision cleared. Partially, the left eye was gone, he would learn later, and he saw Dawson still at the gunner's station, still traversing the turret, still doing his job.
"Fire!" Kowalski screamed, and Dawson fired. The second Panzer IV died. Kowalski did not see it. He was on the floor of the turret basket,
trying to stop the bleeding from his face with his hands, trying to stay conscious, trying to remember what he was supposed to do next. Above him, Dawson was yelling something. "Panther! Panther! Bearing right!" And then the gun fired again, and the Sherman rocked with each recoil. And somewhere outside, metal was screaming, and men were dying.
Kowalski pulled himself up by the turret ring. His left eye was a ruin of blood and vitreous fluid, but his right eye still worked, and through it he saw the battlefield. 2 Panzerfausts burning. The Panther stopped, smoke pouring from its engine deck. Dawson's last shot had found the rear armor, penetrating the engine compartment and killing the transmission. The crew was bailing out, running for the trees, leaving their crippled vehicle behind.
But the Tiger was still coming. It emerged from the smoke like something from a nightmare, its gun already traversing toward the Sherman. Kowalski saw the muzzle flash, saw the tracer coming toward him, and knew, with the absolute certainty of a man who has seen death approaching, that this was the end.
The round struck the front of the turret, directly on the gun mantlet. The impact was catastrophic. The mantlet shattered, the gun tube was wrenched sideways, and a piece of armor the size of a dinner plate was blown into the interior of the tank. It struck Dawson in the chest, killing him instantly. It continued through the turret and lodged in the radio equipment, destroying what remained of the communications system.
The 76mm gun was disabled, the breech mechanism was jammed, the tube bent at a 15-degree angle. Donna could no longer fire. But Donna was still alive, and so were 3 of her crew.
Hello. What happened next became the subject of after-action reports, intelligence analyses, and decades of historical debate. The official record states that at approximately 11:05 hours, the Tiger I and its supporting infantry withdrew from the crossroads at point 147 and did not return. The reason for this withdrawal remains unclear.
The crew of Donna knew the reason. They had lived it.
After the 88mm round disabled the main gun, Kowalski had approximately 7 seconds to make a decision. The Tiger was reloading. The 88 had a rate of fire of 6 to 8 rounds per minute in optimal conditions, but the interior of the Tiger was cramped. The loader was probably fatigued, and Kowalski estimated that he had at least 7 seconds before the next round would be ready. 7 seconds to decide whether to abandon the tank and run or to stay and die.
He chose a third option. Washington, ram 'em! It was insane. A Sherman ramming a Tiger was like a terrier attacking a grizzly bear. The Tiger weighed nearly twice as much, was armored 3 times as heavily, and could crush the Sherman like a tin can. But Kowalski was not thinking about physics, he was thinking about psychology. He was thinking about what it would feel like to be inside the Tiger, to see this half-destroyed American tank, its turret shattered, its gun disabled, its commander bleeding from a wound that should have killed him, suddenly lurch forward and accelerate directly toward you. He was counting on the Germans being sane. And sane men, when faced with the apparently insane, hesitate.
Washington did not hesitate. The Ford engine roared, the damaged track screamed in protest, and Donna surged forward at the best speed she could manage, perhaps 15 miles per hour, barely a jogging pace, but accelerating directly at the Tiger with a determination that had nothing to do with tactical calculation and everything to do with rage.
The Tiger fired. The round passed over the Sherman's hull. The German gunner, startled by the sudden movement, had not adjusted his aim. The round struck the ground behind them and exploded, showering the rear of the tank with dirt and fragments, but causing no significant damage. The Tiger's loader scrambled for another round. The Tiger's driver, watching this apparition of destruction bearing down on him, did what any sane man would do. He reversed. The Tiger I, for all its fearsome reputation, had a significant weakness: its transmission.
The Maybach HL230 engine was powerful but unreliable, and the Henschel transmission was notoriously prone to failure under stress. Rapid changes of direction, precisely what the driver was now attempting, could cause the gears to strip, the final drives to shatter, the entire 60-ton machine to become an immobile pillbox. Kowalski did not know this. He only knew that the Tiger was moving backward, that the gap between them was remaining constant, that the second shot had not come. He kept Washington driving forward, kept the pressure on, kept the burning Sherman pointed at the German tank like a guided missile of steel and defiance.
At 11:07 hours, the Tiger's transmission failed. Kowalski heard it, a grinding, shrieking sound of metal destroying itself, and watched as the massive tank slewed sideways and stopped. The turret continued to rotate, the gun searching for a target, but the vehicle itself was immobilized. The crew had a choice: stay and fight from a fixed position, or abandon the tank and retreat.
They chose to retreat. The hatches flew open, and 5 men in black uniforms scrambled out and ran for the trees. Behind them, the Panther crew was also running. The infantry that had been advancing through the forest had stopped, uncertain, watching the insanity unfold before them. A half-destroyed Sherman had just charged a Tiger and won. The rules of armored warfare had been broken. Nothing made sense anymore. At 11:09 hours, a German officer, a captain, judging by his insignia, stepped out of the trees and blew a whistle. The infantry began to fall back, not in panic, not in rout, but in orderly withdrawal. They were pulling back, reassessing, looking for another route to their objectives. The crossroads at point 147 was not worth the cost.
By 11:15 hours, the Germans were gone. The forest was silent, except for the crackle of burning vehicles and the groans of wounded men. Donna sat in the middle of the crossroads, her gun destroyed, her turret shattered, her crew reduced from 5 to 3, her tracks grinding ominously with every movement. She was, by any reasonable definition, a total loss. But she had held the crossroads, and the Germans had pulled back.
Oh. They found relief at 14:47 hours. A column from the 7th Armored Division, fighting its way east towards St. Vith, stumbled upon the crossroads and the wreckage that surrounded it. The lead vehicle, a Sherman from Baker Company, stopped short when its commander saw what awaited him.
4 German tanks destroyed or disabled. At least 30 German infantry dead. A trail of abandoned equipment and wounded men leading back into the forest. And in the center of it all, a single American Sherman that looked like it had been through a meat grinder. Turret shattered, gun bent, armor scarred with dozens of impacts, flames still licking at the destroyed external fuel tank. But the engine was running. The flag was still flying from the radio antenna. And a one-eyed staff sergeant was standing in the commander's hatch, bleeding from a dozen wounds, holding a Thompson submachine gun in hands that would not stop shaking.
"Sergeant Edward Kowalski," he said when the relief column's commander approached. "3rd Armored Division. We were ordered to hold this crossroads until relieved." He paused, swaying slightly. "I believe you're the relief."
The captain who commanded the relief column, a man named Richardson from somewhere in Ohio, looked at the carnage around him, looked at the destroyed Sherman, looked at the young sergeant who should have been dead 12 times over.
"How many were you?"
5, Kowalski said. "There were 3 of us now. Russo and Dawson didn't make it."
And how many of them?
Kowalski tried to count. The numbers blurred in his mind, mixed with blood and exhaustion and the faces of men he had killed. 4 tanks, he said finally. Maybe 30 infantry, maybe more. I lost count. Captain Richardson was silent for a long moment. Then he removed his helmet and held it over his heart, a gesture of respect that transcended rank. "Sergeant,
I'm going to make sure someone knows what you did here today."
Kowalski shook his head. The movement sent pain lancing through his ruined eye socket, but he barely noticed. "Just get my boys to an aid station, sir. That's all I want."
They evacuated Kowalski, Washington, and Steinberg to a field hospital near Bastogne. Belladonna was deemed unrecoverable and left at the crossroads, a monument to the battle she had fought. Later, when the German offensive was finally contained and the Allies began their counterattack, someone took a photograph of the destroyed Sherman with its bent gun and shattered turret. The photograph made its way back to the United States and appeared in Life magazine in February 1945 with a caption that read, "The Tank That Wouldn't Die."
The article did not mention Rousseau's name. It did not mention Dawson's name. It did not explain that the tank had survived because 5 men, 4 of them still boys, had decided that survival mattered less than duty, that fear could be overcome by will, that a half-destroyed machine could still be a weapon if the men inside it refused to give up.
The article called it a miracle. The crew knew better. Miracles were acts of God. What happened at Point 14-7 was an act of men. Staff Sergeant Edward Kowalski received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at the crossroads. The citation mentioned his leadership under fire, his tactical improvisation, and his personal bravery. It did not mention that he spent 3 months in a hospital recovering from his wounds, that he lost his left eye permanently, that he woke up screaming for the first 2 years after the war, dreaming of fire and blood and the sound of metal tearing through human flesh.
Private First Class Harold Washington received the Silver Star. He returned to Detroit after the war and opened an automotive repair shop that specialized in difficult cases, transmissions that other mechanics had given up on, engines that should have been scrapped, machines that everyone else said were beyond saving. He never spoke about the war, but his customers noticed that he treated every vehicle like it was a living thing, like it had a soul that deserved respect. He died in 1987, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His obituary mentioned his military service, but did not explain what he had done to earn it. Private Eugene Steinberg received the Bronze Star with V device. He went home to Philadelphia, finished high school, and enrolled in Temple University on the GI Bill. He became a psychologist specializing in trauma, spending 40 years helping other veterans find their way back from the darkness. He wrote a book in 1978 called The Crossroads, which told the story of that December morning in clinical, detached prose, never mentioning that he had been there, never admitting that the young soldier he described loading shells into a jammed gun while bleeding from shrapnel wounds was himself. He outlived the others, dying in 2011 at the age of 85, the last survivor of Belladonna's crew. Private First Class Anthony Rousseau was buried in the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium, one of 7,992 American soldiers interred there. His mother received a telegram on December 29, 1944, informing her that her son had been killed in action. She wore black for the rest of her life and kept his photograph on her bedside table until she died in 1971. She never knew exactly how her son had died, only that he had died bravely in service to his country. It was enough. It had to be enough. Corporal William Dawson was buried beside Rousseau. His parents in Tallahassee received the same telegram, the same cold comfort of vague praise. They established a scholarship in his name at his former high school, given each year to a student who demonstrated courage, determination, and service to others. The scholarship still exists today, funded by an endowment that has grown over the decades, a small flame of memory in a world that has largely forgotten the war that killed him.
And the crossroads itself? Point 147 remains, though the designation has been forgotten. It is a rural intersection now, surrounded by farms and forests, unremarkable except for a small stone marker that was placed there in 1984 by a group of Belgian citizens who had researched the battle that took place on their soil. The marker is in French and English, and it says simply, "Here, on December 17, 1944, 5 American soldiers held this crossroads against overwhelming force. 2 gave their lives."
All gave everything.
The marker does not mention the tank. It does not need to. The tank was never the point. The men were the point. The decision to hold, to fight, to refuse surrender even when surrender was the only rational choice, that was the point. The tank was just metal and oil and ammunition. The men made it something more.
The Germans who survived the battle remembered it differently. In interviews conducted decades later, several veterans of the 1st SS Panzer Division recalled the engagement at the crossroads with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. They had expected easy victory. They had found something else entirely.
"We could not understand it," one former tank commander said in 1983. "The Sherman was destroyed. We could see that it was destroyed. The gun was useless, the armor was breached, there were dead men inside. But it kept coming, it kept fighting. When it charged the Tiger, when it charged our Tiger with no weapon, no hope, nothing but the will to fight, I thought I was seeing ghosts."
I thought perhaps the stories about the Americans were true, that they were not men, but something else, something that did not know how to die.
He paused, an old man remembering a young man's war.
We pulled back because we did not know what else to do. You cannot fight an enemy who does not know he is beaten. You cannot defeat a man who refuses to admit defeat. We went around the crossroads, found another route, continued the offensive. But I have thought about that Sherman for 40 years. I have wondered who was inside it, what drove them, what made them choose to die rather than run. He shook his head slowly. I never found the answer. Perhaps there is no answer.
Perhaps some things cannot be explained, only witnessed. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month after the engagement at Point 147. The Germans pushed forward, encircled Bastogne, threatened to split the Allied armies, and reached the strategic port of Antwerp. For a few terrible weeks, it seemed possible that the tide of the war might turn, that the sacrifices of Normandy and the liberation of France might be undone by this final, desperate gamble of the Third Reich.
It did not turn. The Allies held. Bastogne did not fall. The skies cleared on December 23rd, and Allied aircraft began to hammer the German supply lines, turning the offensive into a logistical nightmare. Patton's Third Army drove north, relieving Bastogne on December 26th. The German advance stalled, then reversed, then collapsed. By the end of January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated, and the Allies were preparing for the final drive into Germany. The cost was staggering. Approximately 19,000 Americans were killed, 47,500 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. German losses were even higher, an estimated 100,000 casualties, 800 tanks destroyed, and irreplaceable reserves of fuel and ammunition expended in a gamble that failed. The Battle of the Bulge did not end the war. That would take another 4 months and hundreds of thousands more deaths, but it ended any realistic hope of German victory.
After the Bulge, the question was not whether Germany would fall, but when, and at what cost. Kowalski was not there for the end. He was in a hospital in England when the Germans surrendered on May 8, 1945, still recovering from infections that had set into his wounds, still relearning how to see the world through one eye, still waking in the night with screams caught in his throat and the smell of burning metal in his nostrils. He heard the news on the radio in the ward, surrounded by other broken men, and felt nothing. The war was over. The war would never be over.
Both things were true.
He went home to Michigan in July 1945. His mother met him at the train station, crying so hard she could not speak, holding him like she had held him when he was a child, before the war, before the world had taught him what men were capable of doing to each other. His father shook his hand, a formal gesture that meant more than any words could convey, then turned away to hide the tears he was not supposed to shed. They did not ask about the war. He did not offer. Some things could not be communicated across the gulf between those who had been there and those who had not. Kowalski had crossed into a country that his parents could not enter, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to find his way back.
He married in 1948, a woman named Margaret, a nurse he had met during his recovery, who understood silence and did not fear it. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and Kowalski worked at the Ford plant in Dearborn, building the cars and trucks that were reshaping American life. He never told his children about the war, never explained the medals in the box in his closet, never described the morning at the crossroads. But sometimes, late at night, Margaret would find him standing at the window, looking out at nothing, and she would know without asking that he was there again, in the snow and the fog, with the German tanks burning and his friends dying, and the whole world reduced to a single, simple question: hold or fall? He always chose to hold. Even in memory, even in dreams, he chose to hold. Edward Kowalski died on November 11, 1994, Veterans Day, at the age of 72. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but his family knew that his heart had been failing for 50 years, worn down by a weight that never lifted, a debt that could never be repaid. He was buried with full military honors at a cemetery in Michigan, his Distinguished Service Cross pinned to his chest, his family standing in a row beside the grave. The priest spoke about sacrifice and duty and the debt owed to those who served. He spoke about heaven and peace and the end of suffering. He did not speak about the crossroads, about the half-destroyed tank that kept firing, about the 5 men who held a position they should have abandoned because someone had to hold it, because someone had to be willing to die so that others might live. He did not need to speak about it. The people who mattered already knew. After the funeral, Kowalski's widow gave his medals to his eldest son, Edward Jr., who had served in Vietnam and understood, in his own way, what his father had carried. Edward Jr. kept the medals in a shadow box on his wall, beside a photograph of his father in uniform, young, unscathed, unaware of what was coming, and a small piece of steel that his father had carried in his pocket for 50 years without explanation. It was a fragment of the Sherman's armor, cut from the turret of Donna on the day the relief column arrived. It was jagged, discolored by heat and impact, worn smooth in places by decades of handling. It was, in itself, meaningless, a piece of scrap metal from a destroyed machine in a war that was becoming history, then legend, then myth. But Edward Jr. understood what it meant. It meant that his father had been there. It meant that his father had survived. It meant that on a frozen morning in December 1944, a half-destroyed tank had kept firing, and the Germans had pulled back, and the crossroads had held, and the war had continued until it could be won. It meant that some things were worth dying for, and some men were willing to prove it. The fragment sits in the shadow box still, beside the medals and the photograph, in a house in Michigan where Kowalski's great-grandchildren sometimes visit and ask about the old soldier in the picture, the one with the eye patch and the distant smile. Their parents tell them what they know, which is not much, that he was in the war, that he was brave, that he did not like to talk about it. The children nod and accept this, as children do.
and go back to their games and their screens and their world that cannot imagine what it was like to be cold and afraid and certain of death in a forest far from home. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the gift that Kowalski and his crew gave was precisely this: a world where children could grow up without knowing what their ancestors had endured, without having to make the choices that war demands, without having to learn what they were capable of when everything else was stripped away. Or perhaps the gift was something else. Perhaps it was the knowledge, preserved in records and memories and fragments of steel, that ordinary men could do extraordinary things, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, that a half-destroyed tank could be a fortress if the men inside it refused to surrender.
The crossroads still exists. The marker still stands. And somewhere in Belgium, on a December morning when the fog rolls in from the Ardennes and the world becomes a gray and silent place, it is possible, just barely possible, to hear the echo of engines, the crack of gunfire, the voice of a young sergeant from Michigan telling his men to hold. To hold until relieved.
To hold until the end.
To hold